The camera was still running when it looked up. That is the thing I have returned to, in the dark hours, in the particular silence of 3 in the morning when the house settles around me, and the oaks at the field edge move in the wind. Not what it buried. Not the 11 nights of footage I watched until my eyes burned raw. But that single moment, captured on a trail camera I mounted on a fence post like any man would mount a fence post camera, when its head turned slow and deliberate as a clock hand, and it looked directly into the lens, not past it, not near it, into it, with the full and settled weight of something that had known the whole time that it was being watched and had simply been waiting for me to be ready to acknowledge that. I am 63 years old. I live alone on 42 acres of fallow farmland in the hill country of southern Missouri, and I have lived that way for going on 17 years now. I was not always alone. I am not the kind of man who was always alone by nature, though I became that kind of man, or at least the kind who wears aloneness like a coat he has forgotten he can take off. I came here after the marriage ended, and after the last deployment, and after a period of my life that I have no interest in naming or examining in detail. I came here because the land was cheap, and the nearest town was far enough away that I could see the headlights of cars on the county road from my porch without feeling like company was imminent. I came here to be left alone. I believe I succeeded in ways I did not fully anticipate. What I'm going to tell you happened over 2 years, though the truth is, it was building longer than that, the way all important things build, invisibly, in the unremarkable middle of an ordinary life before they become impossible to ignore. The world I thought I knew, the orderly, bounded, measurable world a military career and a practical temperament build around a man, turned out to have rooms I had not suspected. I am going to describe those rooms to you as precisely as I can, with the same attention to detail I was trained to give field reports. Because I have no reason left to soften any of it, and because if I am going to tell it, I would rather tell it once and tell it fully. The first night I noticed the disturbed ground, it was the 2nd week of October. I have the date in the first notebook. October 9th. The temperature that morning was 31 degrees, and there was a thin frost on the grass in the lower field that caught the beam of my flashlight and turned it silver. I had gone out before sunrise to check a section of fence along the southwest corner where the field drops toward the creek bottom, a stretch that deer pressure had been working against since August. I found the break I had come to repair, about 40 feet of wire, sagged between 2 posts, and I was working on it in the dark with my gloves off because you cannot properly work fence wire with gloves on when I noticed the ground. 4 feet by 3, roughly. A patch of turned earth in the corner of the field, about 12 feet from the fence line on the field side. The frost was on the surrounding grass, but it was not on the turned patch. Fresh disturbance. The soil had been moved and then pressed back down, not scattered the way a digging animal scatters it, but tamped flat. Even in the pre-dawn dark, I could see the deliberateness of it. There was a uniformity to the surface, a flatness that did not come from anything I could name. I finished repairing the fence without any further thought, or, at least, I told myself I was not thinking about it. And I walked back to the house in the gray October morning with my hands cold and my mind running a track I was not quite willing to follow yet. I told myself it was deer, a deer pawing at frost, hard ground looking for something beneath. I sat on the porch with my first cup of coffee and watched the light come up over the east ridge, and I told myself that in an entirely unconvincing way. Something about the size of the disturbed patch was wrong for deer work. Something about the precision of it. A deer makes a mess of the ground when it digs or paws. What I had found in the southwest corner was not a mess. I thought about it all day. I thought about it while I split wood behind the barn in the morning sun. the good sound of the maul and the smell of fresh cut oak filling the yard. I thought about it while I ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter because I rarely bother with the table when it is just me. I thought about it in the specific way you think about something you are not willing to commit to thinking about directly, the way it sits in the peripheral vision of your attention and occasionally draws your eye. That night, sometime around midnight, I was lying in bed in that state that is not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, when I heard a sound from the direction of the lower field. I have been trying to describe this sound for 2 years, and I still do not have adequate language for it. It was low. It was rhythmic. Not in the way an engine is rhythmic, but in the way breathing is rhythmic, cyclical, patterned, alive. It did not belong to any animal I knew. I lay in the dark, listening to it for what I estimated was about 4 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that came after it was the heavy kind, the kind that has texture, the kind a man with any experience of the world beyond its ordinary surfaces learns to take seriously. I lay there for another hour, listening to nothing, and eventually slept. In the morning, I went back to the southwest corner before coffee, which is not something I ordinarily do. I walked down through the lower field in the cold early light, my boots wet from the dew, and I found what I had gone to look for. A second section of turned ground, the same dimensions as the first, immediately adjacent. And at the edge of it, in a strip of mud between the worked ground and the creekside grass where the overnight dew had kept the surface soft, I found a print. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time, maybe 3 minutes, maybe more, turning my flashlight on it even though the morning was now light enough to see clearly. I do not know why I turned the flashlight on. Perhaps I needed the directness of the beam to confirm what I was looking at. Perhaps I needed to do something with my hands. It was bipedal. The first thing I registered was that it was bipedal, made by something walking on 2 legs. The length from heel to the front edge, which I can only call the ball of a foot, because that is the most accurate description, was 17 1/4 inches. I measured it with the folding ruler I keep in my jacket pocket, the one I have kept in one jacket or another since my engineering days in the Army. The depth of the impression in that mud was significant. The mud was not particularly soft. It had been cold for 2 weeks, and the ground was only soft there because of the proximity to the creek and the overnight dew, and the impression was still a full half-inch deep at its center. The weight required to make that impression in that substrate I estimated at over 400 pounds, possibly considerably more. Something heavy, something bipedal, something with a foot, nearly 1.5 feet long. I walked back to the house. I made coffee. I drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the lower field, which was just a field, green and quiet in the October morning, with nothing visible in it that would explain anything. Then I went to the barn and found my 2 trail cameras, the Bushnell units I had used for deer scouting before I gave up hunting. I checked the batteries. Both sets were still functional. I checked the SD cards, I formatted them both, and I walked back down to the southwest corner and mounted the cameras, one on the corner fence post with the motion sensor angled toward the disturbed ground, one on the low branch of a sycamore about 20 feet to the north and east. I angled them so their fields of view would overlap, so that anything that stood in that corner would appear on both of them. I checked the angles twice. I walked the field in front of each camera to confirm the motion sensors would trip on something moving in the critical zone. Then I walked away, and I waited 3 days before pulling the cards. I repaired the west fence line on the 2nd day. I cleaned the gutters on the barn on the 3rd. Normal work, ordinary work, the kind of work a property of 42 acres generates in endless supply, regardless of what a man is or is not thinking about. I went to bed each of those 3 nights and lay awake listening to the lower field, and heard nothing, or told myself I heard nothing, which is not quite the same thing. On the morning of the fourth day, I drove into town and bought a new notepad at the hardware store, the kind with the hard cardboard cover, the kind I used for field notes in the Army. I do not know why I bought it before I had looked at the footage. I think some part of me already knew I was going to need it. I pulled the SD cards after lunch. I made a full pot of coffee, carried the laptop to the kitchen table, and I sat down in the afternoon light and I started from the beginning of the first card. Deer. A raccoon investigating the base of the fence post. Wind in the grass. An empty field in the gray-green light of the infrared sensor. An hour of nothing. 2 hours. The timestamp in the corner of the frame ticking forward in the dark. 11:17. 11:40. 12:04. And then, at 2:47 in the morning of the second night, the motion sensor tripped and the frame filled with movement, and I leaned toward the screen without deciding to. I want to tell you precisely what I saw. Not approximately, not through the softening filter of what I have since read or been told or theorized about such things. What I saw with my own eyes on that screen, in my own kitchen, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, was this. Something walked into the frame of the camera. It was upright, moving on 2 legs, covering ground in a stride that was long and smooth and entirely unburdened by any hesitation. The build of it was the first thing the mind struggled with. Broad, extraordinarily broad through the chest and shoulders, in a way that had no reference point in my experience. Not the wideness of a fat man or an oversized man, but the wideness of something built for power in a configuration I did not have a word for. The chest was deep. The arms were long, proportionally longer than a human's arms, and they did not swing at the sides the way human arms swing, but moved slightly forward, slightly out, as if the upper body carried its own counterbalance. The neck was thick and short, and the head sat forward on it in a way that was not human, but that was not quite animal in any category I knew either. The head was the part I kept coming back to when I rewound the clip, even in trail camera resolution. Even in the pale green wash of night vision infrared, the shape of the head was unambiguous. The muzzle was pronounced. Not dramatically, not cartoonishly, but enough. The ears were high on the skull. The skull itself was broader across the top than a human skull and narrower at the chin. The fur, and it was clearly fur, was dark, the color of wet creek mud, covering everything I could see. It walked to the disturbed ground at the corner of my field without hesitation, without searching, without any of the tentative approach behavior of an animal entering unfamiliar territory. It knew exactly where it was going. It had been there before. It crouched at the edge of the worked earth, and it began to dig. I watched 22 minutes of that clip without moving. I watched it work with a focus that I have no word for except intentional. There is a quality to intentional movement that the body recognizes even when the mind is still negotiating its response. The way a surgeon moves, the way a craftsman moves when the work demands everything. It dug with its hands, and I use that word advisedly because what I saw were not paws in the sense I understand paws. The motions were dexterous, directed, purposeful. It removed earth to a depth I estimated at 12 to 15 inches. It placed something in the hole, and whatever that something was, the camera at that angle and distance could not resolve it into identifiable detail. It covered the hole carefully, pressing the earth back in layers, smoothing the surface with flat-palmed pressure until it was as uniform as the rest of the worked ground. Then it stood. It straightened to its full height, which in the context of the fence post I had calibrated against, I estimated at between 7 and 7.5 feet, and it stood at the edge of the worked ground for 1 minute and 30 seconds. I counted in retrospect from the timestamp. standing still, head slightly bowed, not scanning for threats, not listening with the alert posture of a prey animal or a predator, still in a different way, still in the way that has nothing to do with survival. Then it turned and walked back to the tree line, and the infrared of the camera watched it go until the dark absorbed it completely. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that clip ended, long enough for the afternoon light to move from yellow to the flat gray of early evening, and for the first stars to come up outside the window. I played the clip 3 more times. And then I pulled up the second camera, the sycamore camera with the more oblique angle and the slightly wider field of view. I scrubbed to the same timestamp. And there, at the very edge of the frame, in the peripheral dark where the camera's range ended and the tree line began, I saw what I had missed entirely the first 3 viewings. A shape, upright, not moving, standing in the tree line in the same spot for the full 22 minutes of Cain's work, watching. Different from Cain in build, slightly narrower, slightly less massive in the shoulders. But there, 2 of them. I am going to ask you to think about what that meant, what it meant to me in that kitchen on that evening, to understand that this was not a single animal making unexplained nocturnal visits to a field. What the second camera told me was that the first one had not come alone, that while it worked, something else stood in the shadows and watched. One performing a task, one standing guard while the task was performed. In the Army, we had a name for that arrangement, and the name was not about animals. The name was about intention, about the division of a role between individuals who understood each other's purpose and trusted each other enough to divide it. The next 8 nights they came back. I know this because I pulled the cards every morning, and I documented every visit in the notebook with the hard cardboard cover. Date, arrival time, duration, approximate area of new disturbance, observable behaviors. The same too, always. Cain arriving first, always from the same bearing, due south out of the tree line that bordered the creek bottom. Levi appearing in the same position at the same time, the east edge of the tree line, never coming more than 10 feet out of the shadows. The pattern was so consistent across those 8 nights that I began to feel I was watching something as regular and ordered as a scheduled task, something as understood and established between them as any ritual between people who have performed the same thing together many times. The area of disturbed ground grew. I documented its dimensions each morning. By the end of the second week, it had reached roughly 12 feet by 8. And when I stood at the far end of the upper field and looked down at it across the lower field, I could see that the patches were not random. They formed a shape, an oval, but not a perfect one, not geometrically precise, rather the kind of oval a person draws freehand, following a felt sense of the boundary rather than a calculated line. I could not see what the shape meant. I could only see that it was one. On the 7th night, I went down to the lower field. I want to tell you about the decision I made, standing in my kitchen at midnight with my old hunting rifle in my hands, a Remington 700 that I have owned since before the Army, before I knew what I know now about what a rifle can and cannot accomplish. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. I thought about the footage. I thought about the dimensions I'd been documenting, and about the precision I'd observed, and about the second shape standing motionless in the tree line for 22 consecutive minutes, watching. And then I set the rifle down on the kitchen table, and I went out into the dark without it. Part of the decision was practical. I am not a man who pretends that a rifle makes a man invulnerable to everything. I have seen enough to understand the difference between a weapon that changes outcomes and a weapon that only changes the sequence of events while the outcome remains fixed. But that was not the whole of it. The whole of it included something harder to articulate. A sense that bringing a weapon to that field would be a category error, that I was not approaching a threat, that whatever was happening in the southwest corner of my lower field was not about me at all, and that arriving armed would be a kind of rudeness I could not justify. I walked to the upper end of the field and sat down against the fence post at the rise, the spot that gave me the sight line down into the lower field without putting me anywhere close to the worked ground. The temperature was about 28 degrees. I was wearing my heavy coat and 2 layers underneath, and I was cold anyway within the first 20 minutes. The sky was partially overcast, a thin moon showing occasionally through moving cloud, enough light to see the field in pale silver when it appeared, and almost nothing when it did not. I sat and I waited. At 2:19 in the morning, Cain came out of the trees. The cameras had not prepared me for him in person. I understand that now more fully than I understood it then, when I was in the middle of it and could not fully process what I was seeing, because the present tense does not leave you room for full processing. The cameras had given me a silhouette, a shape, a set of measurements I had noted in a notebook. The reality of him in the actual dark of an October night was something else in a way I cannot adequately explain. He was physically present in a way that large wild things are present, in a way that changes the quality of the space they occupy. The air around him seemed different. There was a gravity to him, not metaphorical gravity, something physical, something my body registered before my mind had finished noting the observation. The smell reached me before he was fully out of the tree line, brought to me on the south wind that was in my face, which meant he could not smell me. Creek water, iron, the deep earth smell of old forest ground after rain, the particular combination of fungus and leaf matter and mineral that has no equivalent in a house or a barn or a truck cab. Rich and heavy and entirely wild. He moved without sound. That was the thing that struck me most in the first seconds of watching him in person. He was over 400 pounds, and he moved across frost-stiff grass without making a sound that I could hear from 50 feet away. Not the careful silence of a human trying to move quietly, which always retains a quality of effort and approximation. The true silence of something that has been moving this way its entire life. He went to the worked ground and crouched. And from the east end of the tree line, Levi stepped out to his usual station and stood. I breathed as shallowly as I could manage. I did not move anything except my eyes. I watched Cain work for 40 minutes in the silver-dark field, and whatever I had understood about him from the camera footage was revised and expanded and deepened by watching him in person. The care he took was clearer from 50 feet than it had ever been on a screen. The way he handled the earth was not the way a wild animal handles soil. It was not chaotic. It was not efficient in the brutal, stripped sense of survival efficiency. It was methodical in the way of someone who has done a specific thing many times and knows exactly how it should be done. I shifted my weight at the 40-minute mark, a cramp in my left leg that I had been ignoring until it became impossible, and my boot scraped against the fence post with a sound that in the silence of that field felt enormous. I froze, but it was too late. Levi's head turned. From the east edge of the tree line, in the dark, at a distance of about 60 feet, its head turned in my direction, and I understood with complete and immediate clarity that it had known I was there the entire time. The wind was in my face. I was still and low and dark clothed. There was no physical mechanism by which it should have been able to locate me. But it had. It had been standing watch, and it had known precisely where I was, and it had not reacted until my movement gave me permission to be acknowledged. Cain straightened. He did not look at me. He simply stood at his full height with his back half turned to the tree line, and he and Levi held that configuration, Levi with its gaze on me and Cain upright and still, for perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a long time when you are sitting against a fence post in a dark field trying to breathe normally. Then Levi made a sound. Low. 2 syllables. A falling tone that dropped from somewhere in the middle of its range to something at the lower edge of what I could hear. The kind of sound that is as much felt in the chest as heard with the ears. And Cain turned from the worked ground without looking back and walked into the trees with the same silence and the same unhurried economy of motion with which he did everything. Levi waited another moment. Its gaze rested on me for a beat that I will never forget as long as I am capable of memory. And then it turned and followed. I sat against that fence post until my legs had gone partially numb, and the eastern sky had begun to separate itself from the dark with the first gray suggestion of dawn. I replayed the sound Levi had made. 2 syllables, a falling tone. Not a vocalization I had any instinct to categorize as warning or threat. Something more like an end of a sentence. An instruction of some kind, or perhaps a dismissal, or perhaps something for which I had no category because my entire experience of communication had taken place within a narrower range of possibility than apparently existed. I named them that morning. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of coffee that I let go cold while I turned the night's experience through my mind for the 4th or 5th time, and I gave them names. Cain, for the one who worked the ground. Because of the labor in him, the night after night returning to the same task with the same precision and the same bowed head care, because of something in the quality of his work that felt like it was in service of a debt, though I did not know what the debt was. And Levi for the watcher. Because Levi in the old texts was the tribe set apart for service, for watching over holy things, for standing between the ordinary world and whatever lay behind the veil of it, because that was what I saw in the figure at the tree line every night, a function, a chosen station, a deliberate presence. I know how all of this sounds. I am aware that I am a 63-year-old man alone on 42 acres of hill country farmland, telling you that I named 2 unclassified bipedal beings after biblical figures. I am not asking you to agree with my interpretations. I am only asking you to understand that when you watch something of that intelligence perform that level of intentional behavior across 11 consecutive nights, you begin to apprehend it as an individual, not as a category, not as an animal or a mystery or a threat, as an individual with a history you cannot fully see and a purpose you can only partly read. The 9th night it rained. A hard November rain, the kind that comes in from the northwest and turns the world the same uniform gray as wet concrete, the kind where you cannot tell where the sky ends and the tree line begins. I watched the footage the next morning, certain they had not come, certain that even the most committed nightly ritual would have a weather threshold. I was wrong. At 2:41 in the morning, Cain walked out of the tree line and across the lower field through rain that was heavy enough to wash out the details of the infrared footage into something almost abstract. He moved through it exactly as he moved on clear, cold nights. Without adjustment, without any observable concession to discomfort or inconvenience. Levi was not there that night. Cain worked alone, and in the rain the footage showed only his shape bent to the earth in that focused, economical way, without the usual watcher at the tree line. And I noticed something I had not caught on any of the previous clips. Before he placed each thing in the ground, he paused. 1 second, 2, 3, holding it. The way you hold something before you set it down for the last time. The way you hold something when setting it down is a form of goodbye. I needed to know what he was burying. The weight of that decision is not something I arrived at quickly. I spent 3 days after the 9th night walking past that corner of the field without going to it, sitting on the porch in the cold evenings looking in that general direction, turning the question over. Whatever Cain was placing in that ground was being placed there with intent and with something I can only call reverence. To dig it up felt like reading someone else's letters. It felt like opening a drawer in a house where you are a guest and looking at what the host has chosen to keep private. I have a strong feeling about that kind of trespass. I come by it honestly from a profession where the privacy of the dead and the sanctity of the things left with them were principles I watched men enforce under fire. But I dug anyway. On the morning of the 12th day after I had first found the turned earth, I took my flat spade to the southwest corner, and I chose the oldest section, the first patch, the one from October 9th, and I dug, carefully. 3 inches down, I hit bone. I set the spade aside and used my hands. I cleared the earth slowly, the way you clear it when you are afraid of breaking something. What I found was this: the skull of a white-tailed deer, old and bleached to the white of old bone, the kind of white that comes only from years underground. Around it, nested against it, the remains of smaller animals, bird bones, the fragile, hollow kind, a raccoon skull partially intact, a section of something curved and ridged that I could not identify with certainty, possibly reptile, possibly something else. All of it old. All of it clean of any flesh or connective tissue, stripped down to pure bone by time. All of it placed, not scattered. Arranged around the deer skull the way objects are arranged by someone who knows where each one belongs. This was not a food cache. Nothing here was fresh. Nothing here was useful to any survival need. What I was looking at was a collection. Bones brought from somewhere and placed together, buried together, tended regularly over a period that those bones suggested might be measured not in weeks or months, but in years, possibly decades. I covered it back up. I was as careful as I could be about restoring each piece to approximately the position I had found it in, the way a man is careful when he has been somewhere he should not have been, and wants to leave the least possible trace. I pressed the earth back flat, and I stood up, and I looked at the lower field for a long time in the thin November sun. What I understood, standing there, was that I had been permitted to witness something. Not that Cain and Levi were unaware of my cameras, which I had already concluded they were not, but that the work they were doing in my field was being done in spite of my awareness of it. They knew I was watching. They had known from the beginning, or close enough to it, and they had come back anyway, 11 consecutive nights, to do the thing they had come to do. I had not been expelled, I had not been threatened, I had been present, and they had worked around my presence the way you work around a presence that is acknowledged and accepted, if not exactly invited. I left a gift that night. I went out after dark, around 9, well before Cain would come, and I carried with me the thing I had decided to leave. I do not own many things I would call precious. I am not a man who has accumulated meaningful objects. Margaret took most of what we had when she left, which I did not contest because possessions had never been the currency I was attached to, and because guilt made the contest feel dishonest. What I had left was not much. A wedding ring I still wear on my left hand, which is its own form of stubbornness, a Remington rifle, a folding knife that had been in 3 countries with me and still held its edge, and an old brass compass, my father's, that I had carried since I was 19 years old, and that had been in every pocket of every jacket I had owned in 44 years. I left the compass. I walked to the edge of the worked ground in the dark, and I set it down at the spot where Cain always began his approach from the tree line, the place where his footprints were deepest in the softer earth. I set it with the lid open so the needle pointed north, true and steady in the cold air. And I walked back to the house and I sat in the kitchen in the dark, and I did not turn a light on, and I listened. At 2:14 in the morning, I heard it. Not the working sound, not the rhythmic labor of the previous 11 nights. A single sound, brief, one note that rose and then fell in a way that no instrument I have ever heard approximates. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then nothing. The silence after it was the heavy kind again. In the morning, the compass was gone. I want to be precise about what I felt when I found that empty spot of earth in the gray November dawn. Not triumph. Not the satisfaction of someone who has communicated successfully and received a reply. Something humbler than either of those things. Something closer to relief, which surprised me, because I had not known until that moment how much tension I had been carrying around the question of whether any bridge existed between what I was and what they were. The winter passed. I had not expected them to continue coming through the cold months, but they did. Less frequently than in October, once or twice a week rather than every night. The burial ground, as I had begun to call it in my notebook, continued to expand at that slower pace. I continued to document everything. I continued to leave occasional small things at the edge of the worked ground. Not in any systematic way, not as an attempt at communication, only as what felt like the appropriate acknowledgement of a neighbor. A piece of good river flint, the kind you can start a fire with. A length of copper wire, carefully coiled. A dried apple from my own trees, hard and sweet with the concentrated flavor that cold storage gives them. Each time I left something, the footage showed Kane approaching it in the following nights, examining it with what I can only describe as attention. He did not always take the objects. The flint he took immediately, on the first night after I left it. The copper wire he examined twice over 2 nights and left. The apple he took on the 3rd night after I left it, which I noted because 3 nights felt like a considered decision rather than an impulse. I began to understand something from these small data points, something I noted in the notebook in the shorthand I had been using since the first week. He was not taking the things because he needed them. He was taking the things he wanted. There is a distinction between those two categories that tells you something fundamental about the kind of mind making the distinction. December was the coldest month, with temperatures dropping below 0 on 3 consecutive nights around the middle of the month, and a hard ice storm on the 21st that closed the county road for 2 days and took down a section of the north fence. I spent the better part of a morning repairing with frozen hands. On the night of the 22nd, with the temperature sitting at 11 degrees, and the ice in the lower field catching what little moonlight there was, and returning it as a flat silver sheet across the whole expanse of the ground, Kane came. I watched the footage in the morning. He moved across the ice without hesitation and without slipping, which told me something about his weight distribution and the structure of his feet that I noted in the notebook. He worked for 38 minutes. When he was done, he did something I had not seen before. He crouched again, not to work, but simply to be low to the ground, close to the worked earth, in a posture that had no practical explanation I could arrive at. He stayed that way for almost 7 minutes. Then he rose and left. I have thought about those 7 minutes many times. I have no clinical language for what I observed in them. What I have is the word that presented itself when I watched the footage that December morning with ice on my roof and frost on my windows, and the whole world made small and quiet by cold. He was keeping the ground company. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. By February, the burial ground had reached its full extent. I know this because after the 2nd week of February, Kane never broke new ground again. He worked only within the existing oval, sometimes the full perimeter, sometimes specific areas, but never beyond the outer edge. It was as if the boundary had been established and was now fixed. I walked the perimeter of it one February morning when the snow was thin enough on the ground to show the slight raised texture of the worked earth. and I found that the shape was consistent with what I had measured from a distance in the fall. Roughly 12 feet by 8, with a definite orientation. The long axis ran north to south, which I noted without knowing what to make of it. I measured it with the folding ruler and noted the measurements in the second notebook, which I had started in December when the first one was full. I am aware that this is the part where some of you, if you have stayed with me this long, are going to question whether what I was observing was what I believed it to be. I am aware that the mind finds patterns, that a man alone on a property for 17 years who has watched too many hours of trail camera footage in his kitchen might be constructing a meaning that is not actually present in the evidence. I have asked myself that question sincerely. I have sat with it for long stretches of the winter evenings when there is nothing to do but read or think or watch the fire. And what I keep coming back to is the notebooks. 47 nights of footage, 2 notebooks of observations with dates and measurements and behavior descriptions, all of it documented as it occurred rather than reconstructed from memory. A pattern that remained consistent across 8 months of irregular but regular visits. 2 distinct individuals with distinct behaviors, distinct roles, distinct responses to the objects I left. The thing with the sound at the fence post, the compass, taken. I am not constructing this story. I am reporting it, as faithfully as I know how. I am also aware that I am supposed to tell you, somewhere in here, to subscribe to whatever channel this lives on, and to click some kind of bell icon that apparently tells the internet you want to hear from me again. The person who helped me put this footage together and turn it into something you can watch tried to explain the algorithm to me twice, and I understood approximately none of it both times. I am 63 years old, and I spent my career learning to navigate forests and foreign countries and other men, which I was reasonable at, and I have spent my post-career years learning to navigate 42 acres of Missouri hill country alone, which I have become adequate at. YouTube is beyond me, and I have decided to make my peace with that. If you are still here after everything I have just told you, I am glad you are here. That is all I know how to say about it. In January, on a night when the temperature dropped to 8 degrees and the ground in the lower field was frozen hard as concrete, I pulled the cards to find something I was not expecting. A third entity had appeared in the footage. Not Cain, not Levi. Something that crossed the far edge of the Sycamore camera's field of view at 4:19 in the morning, moving from east to west across the lower field in a direction that would take it toward the burial ground. It covered the full width of the camera's frame in 3 seconds. I have replayed those 3 seconds a number of times that I am somewhat embarrassed by. The build was different from both Cain and Levi. Lower, faster, more lateral in its movement. Not the upright stride of the other two, but something with a different center of gravity, something that moved along a different axis. And then it was gone, past the edge of the frame, into the dark in the direction of the worked ground, and the camera showed nothing after it but the frozen field and the frost-bright grass. I mounted a third camera the following morning, pointing east along the field edge from the far fence post, trying to expand the coverage and catch whatever that third shape had been if it returned. I spent most of that day laying wire through the frozen ground to run power to it, working with numb fingers in the gray January cold, telling myself the whole time that I was being ridiculous, that I was a 63-year-old retired soldier alone on his own property, running electrical wire in frozen ground to catch footage of something he did not have a name for. I finished the installation before dark and went inside and made soup on the stove and ate it at the kitchen table in the warm yellow light, and I felt, I will admit, a particular kind of contentment, the satisfaction of a problem engaged with, the old familiar feeling of a task undertaken with care and followed through. The third camera caught nothing unusual in the weeks that followed. Whatever had passed through the Sycamore camera's frame on that 8-degree January night did not return, or did not return within the camera's coverage. The next morning, after that January night, the most recent section of the burial ground had been disturbed, not worked in the careful, methodical way of Kane's visits. Disturbed. Dug into quickly and covered back over with less precision than everything else in that ground had been given. I documented it with photographs taken on my phone, the first photographs I had taken of the ground directly, and I noted in the second notebook that the disturbance was concentrated in the most recently worked area, the section Kane had last added to in late December. I did not dig into it. I covered Kane's compressed surface back as flat as I could manage where it had been roughened, pressing it down with the flat of my hand in the January cold, and I stood up with soil on my gloves, and I looked at the field for a long time. I do not know what passed through the edge of that camera. I have chosen to hold it as an open question, which is the most honest position available to me. What I know is that, whatever it was, its approach to that ground was different in kind from everything I had observed in Kane and Levi, not careful, not ceremonial, urgent. And the fact that it had come on a night when neither Kane nor Levi was present felt significant in a way I recorded in the notebook but have never resolved. I mentioned it here because it is part of the account, and the account should be complete. I leave you to make of it what you will. Spring arrived with the particular force that Missouri spring has, the green coming back so fast you can almost watch it move, the creek running brown and full, the air shifting overnight from cold to warm in a way that always startles me no matter how many years I have been here. There was a morning in mid-March when I walked out to the porch with my coffee, and the air smelled so different from the previous morning, so suddenly and completely changed, that I stood there for a while, just breathing it. The lower field was coming back, the pale, dead winter grass giving way to the first green shoots. The sycamore that held the north camera had its first small leaves. The world was changing in the way it changes every year, relentlessly and without asking. And I stood on the porch and thought about Kane working the frozen ground in December, and about the compass needle pointing north somewhere in the hill country dark. And I felt something I did not have an immediate name for. Later, I identified it as gratitude, though I could not have said at that moment precisely what I was grateful for. Kane and Levi continued their visits through March and into April, though the character of the visits changed. The burial ground had stopped growing. The new ground was no longer being added. The visits were shorter. The quality of Kane's movements had shifted in a way I noticed in the footage and confirmed when I watched from the upper field on 2 nights that spring. There was something different in how he moved over the worked ground now. Not the focused industry of the fall and winter. Something slower. Something that stayed a moment longer than the task required. He would stand at different points along the perimeter of the oval, not at the center, not at the working spots, but at the edges, as if tracing the boundary of something he needed to confirm was still there. On a night in early April, the third night of a warm spell that had brought the temperature up to 58 degrees by midday, I watched the footage and saw something that stopped me. Kane had come at the usual hour and worked for about 20 minutes. Then, before leaving, he sat down. Not crouched, not in the working posture, but sat, on the edge of the burial ground, with his back to the tree line and the worked earth in front of him. He sat there for 11 minutes. The fireflies were not out yet, it was too early in the season, but the night was warm enough that I could see in the footage, in the slight shimmer of the infrared, the movement of insects over the field. He sat in that warm April dark for 11 minutes, then he rose and left. I watched that clip 4 times in the morning, and the only word I found for those 11 minutes was the same word I had found for Kane's first winter: company. He was keeping the dead company. He was being present with the thing that was no longer present. I know how that sounds. I have known all along how all of this sounds. I am telling you what the footage showed and what the word for it was. I have been careful in this account not to impose the vocabulary of human emotion on things I observed in animals I cannot claim to fully understand. I have tried to stick to what was observable. Dimensions, durations, behaviors, sequences. But I am going to tell you what I saw in those spring visits, and use the word I believe is accurate, because accuracy is what I owe this account. What I saw in Cain on those spring nights was grief, not an approximation of grief, not behavior that resembles grief if you tilt your head and squint. Grief, the specific, recognizable weight of it in the movement of a living thing that has lost something and returns to the last place the lost thing existed. Not because returning serves any practical purpose, but because returning is the only form of fidelity available to the living. I do not know who is in that ground. I do not know what Cain lost, or when, or over how long a period the bones in that careful oval were gathered and placed. I know only what I watched through a camera on a fence post in my own field, and what I watched was love expressed in the only language available to it, which was presence, return, the refusal to let the thing simply be over. In late April, on a Tuesday night when the temperature had finally lifted above freezing for good and the air smelled of wet earth and blooming redbud, Levi did not come. Cain came alone, for the first time since the rainy November night. He worked for less time than usual, perhaps 15 minutes, and then he did something that no amount of previous footage had prepared me for. He turned to face the camera on the fence post, fully, deliberately, from a distance of about 30 feet. He stood there looking into the lens, and the infrared caught his eyes as two pale discs in a dark face, and he stood there long enough for me to understand that this was not accidental. He was not spooked by the camera. He was not investigating an unfamiliar object. He had been aware of that camera since before October was out, and now he was facing it on purpose. Then he made a sound. I have the audio on the clip. 2 syllables. A falling tone. The same sound Levi had made from the tree line in October when I had scraped my boot against the fence post and been found out. The same sound directed at the camera. Directed at me. I am a practical man. I have been a practical man my entire life. I believe in what I can measure and document and confirm. I am telling you that sitting in my kitchen the next morning, watching those 30 feet of infrared field, and that shape, and hearing those 2 syllables directed at a camera by something that knew it was being recorded, I had no practical framework left that was large enough to hold what I was witnessing. I have played that clip more times than I can count. I have played it on quiet mornings, and in the middle of sleepless nights, and once, embarrassingly, in the hardware store parking lot in town on my phone, with the volume low, just to hear it in a place that was ordinary and populated, and had fluorescent lights and an ice machine, and a woman arguing with her kid about something she needed from the garden center. I played it there to see if it still sounded like what it sounded like in my kitchen. It did. The last time Cain came was in early June. The field was thick with early summer grass, and the fireflies had come back. Hundreds of them in the lower field on warm evenings, and on that last night they were moving through the air between the tree line and the burial ground, like a slow drift of uncoupled stars. He came alone. He worked for almost an hour, longer than any single visit I had documented, and when he finished he stood at the center of the worked ground for a long time, not facing the camera, not scanning the field, with his head bowed. In the middle of the oval he had spent 8 months building in careful increments, surrounded by the fireflies. He stood there for 4 minutes. The timestamp tells me 4 minutes. And then he walked back to the tree line, and the dark received him, and he was gone. I checked the cameras every morning for the rest of that summer and into the fall and through the following winter. They tripped on deer and raccoons, and once on a coyote that sat down directly in front of the fence post camera for 20 minutes as if it owned the property. They did not trip on Cain or Levi. They did not catch the third shape on the eastern edge again. The lower field went on being a field. The summer was hot and dry, and the creek dropped low in August, lower than I had seen it in 17 years, and the southwest corner of the lower field cracked and hardened, and the burial ground rose above the surrounding soil by nearly half an inch as the ground dried and contracted around the looser, more porous, worked earth. I walked to it on a hot August evening with a glass of water in my hand, sweating through my shirt in the 9 o'clock heat, and I poured a little of the water on it. I do not know why I did that. It seemed like the right thing to do for ground that had been tended and cared for by something that was not here to tend it anymore. September came, October came, the anniversary. 1 year from the morning, I had found the first turned patch of earth. I walked to the southwest corner of the lower field in the gray pre-dawn with my coffee cup, in the same temperature, the same 31 degrees, with the same frost on the grass turning silver in the beam of my flashlight. I stood at the edge of the burial ground, and I looked at it. The grass had grown over it completely now. The texture was still there if you knew to look for it. The slight rise, the denser green, but standing there in the October dark, you would have to know the field well to find it. A stranger walking that field would walk right over it without suspecting anything. I stood there for a while, and I thought about the first print I had measured with my folding ruler, 17¼ inches, half an inch deep in mud by the creek edge. I thought about 2:47 in the morning, and 22 minutes of footage, and the shape that moved across my field without making a sound. I thought about Levi standing absolutely still in the tree line for hour after hour across 8 consecutive months, watching. I thought about the 2 syllables and the falling tone and the audio clip I have listened to more times than I can account for. And I thought about Cain standing in the center of the oval on a June night surrounded by fireflies with his head bowed for 4 minutes before turning and walking back into the trees for the last time. I have not moved. I have not built over that ground or plowed it or done anything to disturb it. I will not. It is not mine to disturb, it never was. Whatever claim I have to those 42 acres, whatever the deed in the courthouse says about boundaries and ownership and the legal definition of property, that ground in the southwest corner belongs to something that was tending it before I knew it existed, and will likely tend it again long after I am done. The legal document does not reach that far. Some claims are older than paper. I have come to believe that this particular claim is one of them, and that understanding it was the most useful thing I have done on this land in 17 years. What I know is this. I came to this property 17 years ago to be alone. I came here deliberately, with purpose, to build a life at the far edge of what society requires of a person, to reduce my obligations and my exposures down to what I could manage without anyone's help. I was good at it. I became very good at it. Alone became a state I stopped thinking of as a condition and started thinking of as a fact, the way weather is a fact, simply the quality of the air one lived in. I was wrong about the alone. That is what the southwest corner of the lower field taught me, and it taught me in a way I could not argue with because I documented it myself in 2 hardcover notebooks and on SD cards I still have in a drawer in the kitchen. 47 nights of footage total. I was not alone on those 42 acres. I had never been. Something older than my ownership of that land, older than any legal description of it, older than the county road or the fence line or the deed in the courthouse in town, had been here all along. And it had been doing what living things do when they have been alive long enough to have something to mourn. It had been coming back to its dead, regularly, with care. in the dark, with one of its own standing watch, in my field, on my time, with what I can only call the confidence of something that understood its claim on this ground to be prior and permanent. My compass is gone. I have not replaced it. I do not want to replace it. I think about it sometimes, about where it is, whether it is somewhere in the creek bottom or up in the ridge forest, or somewhere I cannot imagine. Whether the needle still points north in the dark of wherever it ended up, steady and true, the way it was always steady and true through everything my father carried it through, and then everything I carried it through afterward. I think it does. I think a compass keeps pointing north regardless of who holds it or where it ends up, because that is what a compass is for. What I understand now, in the early mornings at the edge of the overgrown burial ground, with my coffee cooling in my hand, is that the whole time I thought I was watching something strange and outside the ordinary. I was watching something entirely ordinary, the most ordinary thing in the world, a living creature honoring its dead, coming back to them, refusing to let the silence be the final word. I had spent 17 years alone on this land, thinking that solitude was a kind of wisdom, a kind of earned simplicity. What I actually was, all that time, was a neighbor who had not yet had the decency to introduce himself. The introduction, when it finally came, cost me a compass and 2 notebooks, and more sleep than I will ever recover. I consider it a bargain. I consider it the best use I have ever made of a trail camera and a stretch of fallow ground. I consider it, when I am being most honest with myself in the early morning dark, the closest thing to grace I have been given in a very long time.